We are introducing Reverend Kikan Mike Howard. And I think I will simply say he's going to give us a wonderful talk this morning on the Katagiri Transcripts, which he produces and posts at a website along with a podcast. So take it away, Reverend Kikan.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good, all right, terrific. So yes, thank you for the introduction, Kyoko-san, and it's great to be looking at you and talking to you out at Hokyoji and out in the world. Hello, everyone. As Kyoko said, I'm Kikan Michael Howard. I am the youth practice leader at Clouds and Water Zen Center up in St. Paul. And I'm going to talk about today the Katagiri Transcripts project that I'm working on. So let's see, the background, incidentally, is out in the backwoods at Hokyoji a little bit towards the stream. This is from the, let's see, the family, what is it called? The family kind of practice day a couple of years ago when we were still doing things in person. Anyway, we had a group of people and a couple of us, Dwayne took us out into the woods on a nice walk, and I got this panorama and I think it's lovely. So I thought I'd use this as the background. Here's a little bit to the right. You can see Dwayne and Emma, who, I don't know if you can see it, let's see here, to remember how to point on Zoom, right there. Out in the southeast Minnesota jungle. Good times. Anyway, I hope to be back there in person sometime in the near future as things improve in the world. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Katagiri Transcripts, and the website for that is katagiritranscripts.net, and there is also a podcast, which is you can find on any of the podcast services, or actually if you have a podcast app or service that you're on and you can't find Katagiri Transcripts just by searching for it, please let me know and I'll see if I can fix that and get it out there. And you can find my email address on the site, katagiritranscripts.net. And you can just search for that on Google too, Katagiri Transcripts. Searching on Google will bring up my site. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I got into this, is because I went out on Google looking for Katagiri Transcripts and nothing came up. Well, now something comes up on my site. So let's talk about that. This is what the site looks like when you go there. And as you can see, there's just a list of transcripts. It starts out all nice and blue, meaning that they're actual live links, and there's an About This Website link. So I'm gonna click on that, imaginarily click on that, and then this is what comes up. So I'm just gonna read this quick. About this website. I've transcribed these talks from audio recordings in the online Dainen Katagiri Audio Archive. The talks are a treasure trove of Dharma material, most of which is not found in the 4 books that have been compiled from Dainen Katagiri's teachings. You can read the transcripts on their own or follow along while listening to the recordings, which are referenced at the top of each talk. Katagiri Roshi's energy, enthusiasm, and humor come through even better in the audio, meaning the recordings of him, than in print. On the other hand, he is a non-native English speaker with a Japanese accent, and the audio is of varying quality. So he can be a little hard to understand. People's reports of how hard to understand that is actually varies, but that could be anything up to quite hard to understand. But really, more and more, I think the thing may be that these talks are rather dense. They are brimming over with vital information, which just flies by. These talks demand careful listening and serious reflection. I think the transcripts may help with that. Each talk requires many hours to carefully transcribe. That said, there may still be inaccuracies. This is a work in progress. I am continually adding new transcripts and correcting existing ones. I am transcribing these talks as a way of studying them myself. I'm still a student, although I'm given a lot of interesting stuff to do. I've already found a lot here that is personally meaningful, even revolutionary for me personally. I hope you find something useful or inspiring here as well. And more recently, I've started doing the podcast. This stuff is, I don't mean to belabor this because it's actually pretty simple and does exactly what it says in on the tin, so to speak, which is the Katagiri Transcripts website has transcripts of Katagiri Roshi's talks that I'm transcribing. And not a lot of editorial comment or anything, just that. And the podcast is also just that. It's me reading the transcripts. But anyway, I did work on this description quite a bit, so maybe it'll help. Dainin Katagiri Roshi was one of the prominent Zen masters who brought Soto Zen Buddhism from Japan to America. If anyone does not know, he of course also founded Hokyoji Zen Monastery and is Tokai-san's teacher and connected with a lot of us. Audio recordings of his talks recorded from 1979 to 1989 are made available by Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. But since he was a non-native speaker and the recording quality varied, he can be difficult to understand. Here, these talks are carefully transcribed and read by second generation student Kikan Michael Howard with the intention of staying as true as possible to Katagiri Roshi's words while smoothing out the grammar to make them easier to understand. New episodes will be posted regularly, going through the talks in order. That bit at the end, I think, is kind of key. That reflects a large part of my philosophy in doing this. What I'm aiming for is something that's as close as possible to being able to put on a pair of magic Katagiri Roshi understanding glasses. So if you're like listening to his talks and like, I think a lot of people would be justified in like, what was that, what? And some of that is honestly content because he is a brilliant speaker and is conveying a lot of fascinating stuff. But some of it is just that the recordings are vary quite a lot in quality, and he's speaking with a considerable accent, and his English grammar is kind of all over the place. One thing that I figured out in the process and the kind of the long process of working on these talks is that he's correcting himself like almost constantly as he gives these talks, not correcting what he's trying to say, but correcting how he's saying it, essentially correcting his grammar and his word choice. So what I settled on doing with these transcripts is a style of intelligent transcription. So I'm not transcribing every word that he said, but I'm trying to smooth out and apply the corrections that he's making in the stream of talking. So for example, if he says something and then corrects how he's saying it, then I go with what I interpret to be the corrected version, for example. And there's like a lot of that. But the goal is to be as faithful as possible to what Katagiri Roshi actually said within the limits of my understanding of what Katagiri Roshi said. But here is the challenge, because to really properly interpret what he's saying, you have to actually understand what he's saying. And some of his talks are quite understandable, and some of them get to be more challenging. I'll get into a little bit of that. So like at least one of the talks I can think of, I really understand the edges of it. So I'm doing my best to transcribe his meaning, but you know, as I say, you should keep in mind there may be errors in what I'm saying. And for things that aren't clear in the transcripts, as we'll see, I try to put things in brackets. So I try to do a pretty rigorous job of clarifying which parts I'm really not sure about. Anyway, I should mention, by the way, I'm going to try to just speak until 10 o'clock here. Your standard format is to speak for half an hour and then do 15 minutes of questions. But my own style of speaking is very interactive. So if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm keeping an eye on you and going back and forth between what I'm seeing on the screen here. So you can raise your hand, either your actual hand or your Zoom hand, if you have any questions or comments as we go along, and I will pick up on that. So let's see here. I'm going to talk just really super briefly about how I got into this to give you a little bit more information. As I said, I'm the youth practice leader at Clouds and Water Zen Center. And I've been doing that for a couple years. And before I got into that, I really didn't have much experience with working with children, by which I mean no experience working with children. So it's been like a really challenging couple of years, and but delightful and really educational, but hard. And what I realized along the way, or one thing I realized along the way, was that with the kind of questions I'm getting, both from children and from volunteers, oh, I really don't understand this stuff as well as I would like to. And also there's a lot of interesting areas here where I would like to understand more, and I'm not finding the information on that. So I started doing a lot more research. And that relates to what I'm showing here, which is the Bhava Chakra, which is the wheel of life. I think the thing that finally kind of tore it for me was when I was trying to teach this to the children and dig up a lot of information on what the different parts of this wheel mean. This is the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of life. This is a traditional Buddhist thing going back a long time. Some people say to the Buddha himself. And it kind of visually depicts the basic teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. I won't go into all of that, but figuring this out, there's a lot of detail in how the 6 realms of existence work, what they are, how karma works, what that means, and particularly on the outside rim, there are these 12 things called the 12 links of dependent origination. And I tend to be a little bit plain in my speaking sometimes, and can occasionally get me into a bit of trouble. But I'm just going to come out and say this. I don't think I had ever heard a description of the 12 links of dependent origination that made any sense to me whatsoever. It's like, could be a comprehension thing on my part, but I've been kind of like thinking about that off and on for like, 20 years off and on. And it's like, what are you talking about? So I started doing a lot of research on that. I'm like, can I get to the bottom of this and just figure this out? So anyway, I had a shot at that. And that involved reading a lot of books. There's one that's not on here, which was actually audio talks by, maybe Rushin can help me out with his name. I'm blanking on it right now. Anyway, these are just some of the books I've read over the last couple of years to try to increase my own understanding, not just of Buddhism, but how Buddhism may relate to Western thought, and increasingly to the kind of convergence between Western and Eastern thought, and what's actually going on in the very latest couple decades of neuroscience research and that kind of thing. And also I have particular questions about what emotions are and how to work with emotions in Zen practice, because I think this is very important for working with the children. So this is a part of what I call jokingly, semi-jokingly call Kikan's radical book recommendations. Some of this you're familiar, at least some of this you're familiar with at Hokyoji. For example, Basic Teachings of the Buddha is one that I found out about via Hokyoji because you were studying this a while back. And Rushin, my friend Rushin, brought this up. And we actually ended up teaching a class about this at Compassionate Ocean while we were studying it ourselves. And that was very productive for me. And again, realized a lot more, realized that I had a lot more work to do in understanding this stuff. And there's some other stuff too. The most radical stuff that I'm into these days that you may not be familiar with is in the top row. Works of Carl McLaren and Linda Feldman Barrett on emotions. Integrating that into Zen practice is really interesting, I think. And actually the Carl McLaren stuff is where I'm going next. So anyway, I ended up creating like a whole kind of interpretation, my own infographic on the 6 realms of existence. And this is the kicker, on the 12 links of dependent origination or arising. And this is a work in progress, but I think it was it was great for me to do, and pretty interesting how how this links into modern neuroscience research and modern thinking. I have some things that I would probably tweak in this now, but not bad, I would say, pretty interesting. But the thing was, as I did like a lot of this work, and I'm kind of dragging this on too long here, but as I did a lot of this work, I started realizing that I was getting a little bit radical. And I felt like my stream of thinking was getting a little bit outside some of what I was hearing from my peers in the Zen community, or at least I felt that way. So I wanted to figure out, okay, am I in touch with Zen practice here anymore? So that's where I thought, well, I should check in with Katagiri Roshi and see what he's saying back then. And the interesting thing is, what I discovered is that I was a little nervous about what I would find actually, but what I discovered was briefly that Katagiri Roshi's talks are brilliant, in my opinion, like the best that I've heard. And also he was talking a lot about a lot of this stuff like 30 years ago. Except I wasn't aware of that for some reason. Like one of the things that I find very endearing about Katagiri Roshi, which I'm not sure a lot of people know about, is that as far as I've been able to tell in the talk so far, he talks about Buddhist psychology a lot. From what I understand from his biography on the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center page, he did his college thesis on ego consciousness or something like that. So he was actually pretty interested in this stuff. And the book Flow is actually there because he recommended its precedent book like 20, 30 years ago. I found that fascinating. Anyway, I'm taking up way too much time in the introduction here, so I want to move on. This is a list of the talks. This is all of the recorded talks that are available in Minnesota Zen Meditation Center's online archive. I'm sure you can't see that very well, and you certainly can't make it out, but it kind of gives you a sense of the extent of the project. And the blue ones are the ones that I've transcribed. So anyway, there's 342 talks, 27 transcribed, that's 7% so far. And 10, I've done the podcast as of a couple days ago. So this is slow work. It's slow work because I have to listen to each talk like many times. I used to say that it took me 10 to 20 hours. Oops, I'm sorry, I've been disappeared all this time. It used to take me 10 to 20 hours to transcribe a talk. And that's actually gone up since I did the podcast. I'm kind of, artificial intelligence these days, people talk about training neural networks to like understand things. Well, I'm training my neural network, that is my brain, to specifically understand somewhat poor quality audio recordings of one very specific Japanese Zen master, and then spit that back out onto tape. And I'm refining a lot of my technique in podcasting as I go along. So I'm hoping that things are kind of like getting better as I go along, but it's still very much a work in progress. And what I did, interesting, as I started doing the podcast, I got into like a whole new level of corrections with the transcripts. Because if I'm putting something, if I'm speaking it and putting it in audio form for people to listen to, I found that suddenly I had to be like even more, I had to nail down a lot more of the things that I would have just let slide before. So that involved like even more listening to the talks and trying to tease out those last few words. And what I discovered was I had misheard stuff that I thought I had gotten right the first time. So really only these first 10 transcripts are in what I hope today I would say are like pretty good quality. The rest of the transcripts I still need to get back to and clean them up even more. So this is what a transcript looks like, and we may not even get to much of this. So instead what I'm going to do is read some descriptions of the talks. We'll see if we have any time to get into the actual talks themselves this time around. So one thing that I started doing just recently, actually, in the process of putting the podcast together, is creating summaries of the content of these talks. And these are very subjective on my part, but I'm listening to the talk over and over again. And at the end, as I'm recording it and listening to that, I'm trying to pull together what I think are like the most interesting core parts of the talk as kind of a key into the talk. So I can look at the top of the transcript and remember, oh, it's that talk. Because these talks tend to be like 50 minutes to an hour and a half, the ones with Q&A. When I read them, by the way, they're a lot shorter. So let me read some of the descriptions for you. The first one is Diamond Sutta Introduction. And by the way, this first one, I'm not happy with the audio quality. So the next thing I'm probably going to do is re-record this one and come up with a longer description for this. But this starts out pretty simple. Katagiri Roshi introduces a series of talks on the Diamond Sutra. And he answers the question, if we are sitting in order to help ourselves, should we stop sitting? Then we start getting into some longer descriptions. There's a series of 7 talks on Fukan Zazengi. So talk 1. Katagiri Roshi begins this series of talks on Fukan Zazengi, Zen Master Dogen's universal recommendations for how to practice Zazen, seated Zazen. I'm starting to, one of the refinements, for example, is I'm starting to try to pronounce Zazen as Katagiri Roshi pronounced it. So it's Zazen. In the early recordings, I say Zazen. And now I'm trying to do Zazen. Lot of little details like that. Katagiri Roshi begins this series of talks on Fukan Zazengi, Zen Master Dogen's universal recommendations for how to practice Zazen, seated meditation, by examining the meaning of the critical line, for you must know that just there in Zazen, the right Dharma is manifesting itself, and that from the first, dullness and distraction are struck aside. He introduces a 6-component system for understanding Zazen from a physical and psychological standpoint and discusses how important it is to arrange circumstances and let go. He also talks about life at Eiheiji Monastery. This was right away something I found that was fascinating to me, this 6-component system, as I'm calling it, for understanding Zazen or life in general. And if I had more time in this talk, that's what I plan to get into, but we'll see if we get there. Talk 2. Katagiri Roshi reviews the 6-component system for understanding Zazen that he introduced in the previous talk. And by the way, while I'm thinking about it, there's actually a couple purposes of these summaries. One is to convey what the talk is, but there's also a little bit of trying to sell it a little bit to intrigue any potential audience and go like, that's interesting. So just FYI, as we're reading this, that's kind of the intention. Katagiri Roshi reviews the 6-component system for understanding Zazen that he introduced in the previous talk. He further discusses the relationship between regulation of body and mind, samadhi, one-pointedness, egolessness, no design on having a reward, and shikantaza, just sitting. So a pretty good baseline Katagiri Roshi talk. The distinction between religious Zazen and philosophical or psychological Zazen is explored. There is an extended question and answer period. Those are fun to transcribe, by the way. This part here, the distinction between religious Zazen and philosophical or psychological Zazen, comes up a lot and is one of the most interesting things to me, because this is something that I think Rushin and I were very interested in talking about and exploring, which is this old question, may never be fully resolved. Is Zen a religion, a philosophy? What is it? Katagiri Roshi's answer seems to be, in many cases, that it's a religion, but he defines religion differently than a lot of people would be projecting, in that it's not dogmatic. Long story short here, my understanding is when he talks about religious Zazen, he's talking about Zazen as, for lack of better words, direct experience. That's what religious means to him, as opposed to philosophical. That's my understanding of it. That's just like a quick overview, but that's kind of a really interesting area that I'm tracking as I delve further into these talks. And again, I'm really just at the beginning of this process, as you could see from that list. But that's one very, and again, I want to say this again, it's like, it's interesting that we spent a lot of time talking about this without even realizing that Katagiri Roshi was like giving us this stuff like 30 years ago. So that's interesting. Talk 3. Katagiri Roshi examines the meaning of the line, "From the first, dullness and distraction are struck aside." You may have heard that one, from another angle. And doing this transcript was the first time I actually feel like I've understood what that line meant. Again, Katagiri Roshi's talks are really good if you get into them, in my opinion. He talks about 3 different kinds of zazen, sitting meditation, and why shikantaza is not a means to an end. He also explains what it means to accumulate merit and virtue, how to understand and work with past karma. That was a big thing for me. And why we have to aim at the life after next life. Another big thing for me, which, wake up, Drina. There's a story about let's see here. How to understand and work with past karma and why we have to aim at the life after next life. There's a story about a commando who visited the Zen center. Also, what to do when death taps your back. Are you intrigued at all? That's what I'm going for. Talk 4. Katagiri Roshi discusses the meaning of the line, "In surveying the past, we find the transcendence of both unenlightenment and enlightenment, and dying while either sitting or standing have all depended entirely on the strength of Zazen. In relation to Blue Cliff Record Case 46, Ching Ching, Sound of Raindrops." He talks about life and death and how to cease fire in Zazen. There is a story about a machine that reads brainwaves, and he discusses whether there are any real Zen teachers in the United States. That was a good one. Talk 5, Katagiri Roshi talks about the difference between Zazen itself and seeing Zazen before Zazen or after Zazen, using the example of Gensha Shibi in One Bright Pearl. That's in Shobo Genso. In an extended question and answer period, he explains the difference between philosophical and psychological exhaustion, how to work with the vomit of the mind, and why we should do Zazen for future generations. Does the world disappear during Zazen? Are there techniques in Zen? And is Zen the simplest, most pure way? Here, I think the descriptions are starting to get a little bit interesting because and this gets a little more pronounced later, they're almost turning into almost kind of like pointers into a koan where I'm trying to point out, okay, here's what you might want to look for in this talk. And I found that actually in like the very last of these talks that I'm going to get to in a minute, doing the summary actually helped me to go back and realize, oh, is that what that talk was about? Oh, interesting. I'll get to that in a minute. Talk 6, Katagiri Roshi. I'm just going to finish off these summaries and then we'll do questions. Katagiri Roshi talks about body and mind dropping off from a different angle, from a psychological point of view. This talk focuses on samskara, which is usually translated as impulses, one of the 5 skandhas or aggregates. It also shows up in the 12 links that I was talking about. Here he discusses samskara as the together maker and also as a sort of bridge or door, which enables you to take mind to either the dualistic world or the non-dualistic world, because samskara itself is completely free. This is me attempting to summarize what Katagiri Roshi is saying, which is a little bit dangerous, but I'm doing my best. In relation to this, he explains a key line from Dogen's Genjo koan: "Oneness is not like the moon reflected in the water. When one is bright, the other one is dark." He also discusses the lines from Fukan Zazengi: "It cannot be fully known by the practicing or realizing of supernatural power either, and is it not the principle that is prior to his knowledge and perceptions?" During a challenging discussion on the forces of Prapti and Aprapti, he tells a story about the 1948 Fukui earthquake in Japan. That was this is the one I was alluding to earlier, which I only understand the edges of this one, but it's comforting to me that it sounded like no one else understood it either. So that's what it sounds like. But there was a good story about the 1948 Fukui earthquake in Japan. So you can look forward to that. The conclusion of the series of talks of Fukan Zazengi takes place during a dramatic thunderstorm, the sounds of which Katagiri Roshi integrates into his talk, which was very cool. The Buddha does Zazen during a thunderstorm, but he is not disturbed by the sound of the thunder. What does that mean? Katagiri Roshi discusses why the purpose of Zazen is not to reach a state of no consciousness. This gets back to the difference between Mahayana and earlier forms of Buddhism that Rushin and I, and possibly anyone who was reading Basic Teachings of the Buddha back a year or two ago would be interested in. Also, how to play guitar with 2 hands and 2 feet. A Rinzai Zen master plays a Bach concerto in the Zendo. And what does Manjushri do anyway? All of which is actually in the talk. All right, so I'm just gonna, oh, that's a good one, but I'm just gonna skip to the last one and wrap up. The last talk, the most recent podcast I've done, Diamond Sutra Emptiness. What is a Buddha and what does a Buddha experience? Katagiri Roshi describes 3 kinds of enlightenment: kaku, awareness, satori, and sho, realization or verification. He examines 3 aspects of the utmost right perfect enlightenment from the Diamond Sutra: the marklessness of all things, the marklessness of their emptiness, and the marklessness of their suchness. Also, why we exist. Here's a good promise. Why we exist, how to experience spiritual security, and why we shouldn't get too caught up in Buddhist psychology. All right, that's enough of that. So with that, I apologize for not leaving enough time to actually like read any of the transcripts, which are wonderful, but I have another talk in May, and of course you can listen to me reading the podcast, or you can listen to Katagiri Roshi's actual talks and follow along with the transcripts to help understand, which is what I do. So with that, I would like to open it up to any questions or comments.
Don't forget to unmute yourselves.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Hi, I'm Meredith. This is fabulous. This is wonderful. I'm really excited that you're doing this, because I go to MZMC and I've attempted to listen to these talks, and I know exactly what you mean about the understandability. It's kind of difficult, so thank you. So I have 2 questions. The first question is, are you tagging these? Is there some way to do like a keyword search? So if you want to look at a particular topic. And then my second question, just out of curiosity, is, is Andrea Martin involved with this at all?
Yes, so tagging is something that I have not looked into yet. I believe there, thank you for the question. That's great, by the way. I can't actually see where you are, but I can hear you just fine. Oh, there you are. Okay. Well, the audio worked perfect then. Great. So the tagging, I'm not sure about that. There may be a way to do that via Google if you get into advanced search by specifying this website and adding keywords, but I haven't actually looked at that yet. The other question, and what I do is I have the text files, so I'm like searching them myself because I have like the raw material. So yeah, I will look into that at some point and try to figure out if there's a good way to do that. But today, actually, if you do a search for various things that Katagiri Roshi talked about that few other people talked about, you will probably get search results from Katagiri transcripts already, even like 4th, 5th, or 6th in your results on Google. Just doing a search for, if you do a search for maybe samskara, for example, or some Pali or Sanskrit term. This stuff is already coming up, and a couple people have found the site through that way already. I have sent a message to MZMC, which hopefully got through to Andrea Martin, who I believe maintains the audio talks, and haven't heard anything back yet. But no, she's not actually involved in the transcripts process. I started this because, well, I mean, there may be transcripts that I don't know about. This is something that I wanted to do. This originally started out as a project for myself, and I didn't originally set out with the intent of sharing this. But as I started getting into this and doing more and more work on it, I realized, oh, this is actually important. there is a lot of information here which is not in the books. I think the books are wonderful. If the books weren't there, probably a lot of people wouldn't know anything about Katagiri Roshi at all. But I do notice that when I come across things that are particularly meaningful or significant in the talks to me, like any of the work with the Blue Cliff Record or specific things that I've talked about in this talk, I search for those things in the electronic editions of the books, and I do not find them. So there is a huge amount of material that, as far as I can tell, is untapped here, simply untapped. That's my impression so far. But I will have more of an impression of what that is actually like, you know, maybe like 5-10 years from now. then maybe I'll have like more of an idea about what the overall dimensions of the project are, and like what's new and what's not. It's fascinating anyway. I hope that answers your question. Any more questions or comments? Tokai-san.
Hello. First, I want to say I think you're doing very noble work, Kikan, and I appreciate it. I have yet to visit your site, but you're arousing my interest to do so. The first thing I would suggest is in this sliding scale, where you say pretty okay to understand to pretty hard to understand, you should move that other slide back to totally, completely impossible to understand. So that was my experience. I remember once coming out of a lecture, talking to one of our old time friends, Tony Artino, and we looked at each other and said, "What did he say?" and I gave my impression, and Tony said, No, you didn't say that." He said something totally different. So it was interesting to experience that. A few years later, though, Tony and I met after a lecture, and we just looked at each other, you know, right straight into our eyes, and we were both thinking the same thing. And we said it almost together, you know, his English is getting pretty good. You know, it's like we had that same experience where, wow, he's getting a lot better, you know, using his English. And the other thing I'll say is I probably recorded about half of those talks. And in the beginning, we felt it was intrusive to use a lapel mic. So we just had this little cassette recorder, you know, on the side. And so the audio quality is pretty horrible sometimes. And then the last thing I'm going to say is I really admire your practice of working with the children at Clouds and Water, especially not having children of your own. I had Katagiri Roshi founded a group in Alaska, and after a while, I went up with him as his attendant. And then after he got so busy, they invited me to come up and just lead a 3-week practice period. And, and in the course of that, there were a couple of parents who had a kid or two. And so they asked, "Can you give a Dharma talk for the kids?" And I'd never done that. And I thought, oh, expletive, deleted. So anyway, so, but I did my best, and I'm up there talking. And one of the kids, you know, after I'm talking for about 15 minutes or so, says, "Mommy, I don't like that man." So that was a rude awakening for me, right in the middle of my Dharma talk. So, but, you know, I thought later, you know, it's probably the same with adults. They're just thinking that. You know? Kids just don't have that, you know, what a filter, you know. But after that experience, I decided, for one thing, I had the experience. Then I went back to MZMC, and they were looking for a youth director. And I raised my hand. I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to learn how to do this. And so I learned a little bit after a lot of mistakes. But then what I actually did learn, I think, and I still think this is true, if you can't say what you're trying to say to a kid, you probably can't say it to an adult either. So it's just, you know, it's like a simple level. If you're up here in the air, you know, and it's probably not making any connection to an adult. So that was one of my awakenings. So thank you very much for your work and your talk today. And before we leave, I would like to, after all the questions are done, I'd like to get a close-up of the Hokyoji. Looks like there's a whole room full of people. I can't see very well, but I kind of like to see who's all there. And but anyway, we can finish the questions before that. So.
Thank you, Dokai-san. Yeah, expletive was pretty much my thinking process for the first year. Internally. and working with the children has been certainly challenging, but tremendously clarifying and helpful and useful in how challenging it was. So I really appreciate being able to do that. Although it's a lot sometimes. Well, there was something else I wanted to say something about too, but anyway, basically, yes, thank you for all of that. We have time for, maybe we could make time for like one more question if somebody has one.
Okay, I'm going to say time's up.
Oh, time's up.